I use monofilament thread in my work in a number of ways. A lot for my ditch stitching, and I'll explain that in a minute. But you always want to use the Transfil nylon monofilament thread when you don't want your stitching to show. That's one of the reasons that I use it in the ditch, because one of the cardinal rules, I think, of ditch stitching is that you don't want to see it. So if you use colored thread, and my apologies to everybody who I've ever quilted for, but I've never seen a perfectly pieced quilt. And so you get to that place where things don't quite line up, and if you're using colored thread, that mistake is going to show. With monofilament, it's not going to show. It comes in two shades, clear and smoke, and on this quilt, I used both of them. For the areas where I was stitching on the black, I used the smoke. I used the clear when I was stitching in the areas here in the yellow, which is lighter. If I'm in doubt, like if I'm working on a quilt that has red or purple or one of those kinds of colors, I will take one strand of each of the threads and see which one looks better, and then make my decision from there. Transfil is a new thread from Mettler, and it comes on a 1,000-meter spool. It's nice and soft. Now, one of the things that I want you to be careful of when you choose a monofilament thread is that the monofilament thread is soft enough to work well into your quilt and not cause any problems. And I kind of do a little finger test. I take the spool and I take my finger, and there's this little end sticking out, and I just stick my finger. And I do this, and if I can feel it, if I feel a distinct finger stick, that isn't the thread I want in my quilt. So I just do that until I figure it out. So Transfil passed my finger test. So that was the first thing. So I noticed I could use it on the horizontal spool when I was playing with it. Now, often people will tell you that you need to put your monofilament thread on a vertical spool pin. I found that I didn't have to do that with the Transfil, that it worked just beautifully with the horizontal spool pin. The other thing I want to point out is that I'm using my regular thread tension. I had to make no tension adjustment at all for this Transfil thread. So I'm pretty happy with it. It's going to be my thread of choice when I don't want anything to show. So I'm going to work on this quilt. Some of you are familiar with my fluff and stuff technique, which is how I get big quilts through the machine. And how I do that is I settle the quilt happily in my lap, and I pleat the quilt into my right hand until I'm to the place where I want to start quilting. Now in this one, it's pretty far over. I'm using my knee lift on this machine to raise the presser foot so that I can use both hands to handle the quilt. And all that bulk that I had pleated into my hand, I just shove that right through. And then I'm ready to start. So I'm going to take my Transfil in my left hand, and I'm going to bring the needle down and up again. I just unthreaded the machine. Love that. I can watch that machine thread all day. So I'm going to take the Transfil in my left hand. I'm going to bring the needle down, the needle up, and then pull up my bobbin thread. In the bobbin, I have a cotton thread by Mettler, and I'm using a very lightweight embroidery thread. It's the 60 weight. And the reason I'm using that on this quilt is because I want that bobbin thread to blend in to the back of my quilt, not to stand out. And the 60 weight will do that beautifully. So I'm going to stitch in reverse with a very short stitch. I use a 0.8 stitch. And I stitch in reverse to the end of the seam. I started about a 1/4 inch early and then backed up with tiny, tiny stitches. And what that does is it secures my seam. Then I switch to a full-size stitch and do my stitching. These are my bat scooters. Some of you are familiar with those. And it's what I use instead of gloves to help me move the quilt through the machine. It gives me traction. See how beautifully this is working. Regular tension, no problems. It's just purring right through the machine. I am loving this. There are a number of other things you can use the thread for. You know, it's not just a quilting thread. You can use monofilament anywhere you don't want your stitching to show. I've been told it works well on leather. It can work as a blind hem on curtains. What about serging? You know, quite a few of the garments that we buy, particularly t-shirts when you buy them in the store, those are serged with monofilament thread. This is a nylon monofilament. I like it for its durability, its invisibility, and I think it's going to be quite happy at home with me in my quilting.